Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, it's good to be back with you, Richard,
thanks.
On your very own podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host. And today we are doing one of the most fun segments on the podcast, and I think the one that we probably get the most comments on, and that is the leadership biographies.
Yeah.
We have gone through quite a few now. And
two of my favorite things, leadership and biographies.
Yeah, who knew? You're such an exciting person. So who are we looking at today, Richard?
Well, I thought we'd circle around to Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh, yes.
And the 26th U.S. president. It's based particularly on a biography by H.W. Brands. Brands is one of those handful of historians that just do a really good job on biographies. Thorough, hundreds and hundreds of pages, but well written. He and people like McCullough and a couple of guys like that are just always good. So it's a great biography as well. And Roosevelt's one of the most popular presidents and dynamic leaders, and so it might be a good one to look at today.
Great. Well, I'm excited to dive in. And so if you listen to any of these leadership profile podcasts, we always dive into the early life of the leader, and there's inevitably something that they had to overcome, maybe some things they had to overcome to become the leader that they eventually turn out to be. So can you maybe share with us what some of the issues were that Theodore had to overcome?
Yeah, well, I think most famously, as a child, he had severe asthma. And at times couldn't even, his dad would have to even just carry him around because he was having trouble breathing. And so he was quite frail, very slight frame. Interestingly, when he was about 11, his dad was, he admired his father more than anybody in his life. And so his dad was an influential businessman in New York City, and was adored by Theodore, and gave some significant attention to his son. At times he'd be carrying him around. Some people have even speculated that it almost as if it was a codependent thing, in a sense of Theodore knew that if he had an asthmatic attack, he'd get carried around by his dad and get to spend time with him. And so, but about age 11, he was on a tour with his dad in Europe and was actually walking with him in the Alps, and realized that at 11, if he really worked at it, he could pretty well keep a pace with his father. And it did something in him. Theodore was just always wired in such a way that he was pretty competitive, but he was also very intentional about a lot of things in his life. And so he just committed himself to physical fitness and physical exercise. And so he would do weightlifting and rowing and hiking and running and just anything that he could do that was strenuous, just trying to keep himself in shape. And so he did that his whole life. Was just an outdoorsman, rode horseback, worked on ranches when he was younger, went on safaris when he was older. But the interesting thing was that he was so frail. At first, he couldn't even go to school, because he'd have an asthmatic attack, and they were concerned about him, something happening if he was at school. And so he had to be schooled at home in the early days. And so certainly not the kind of person that you would think, wow, this guy's going to be a great president one day of the United States. He was considered way too frail, kind of just wanted to be with his dad as much as possible. His eyesight wasn't that great either. And so he ultimately wore glasses, which helped some, but in some of the sports, he even just in things like shooting, that you had to kind of be able to see in a distance, he wasn't as good, especially if he couldn't wear his glasses, or maybe certain sports. So his voice wasn't that great either. In fact, he kind of had this, in some ways, an irritating kind of voice, and he sort of compensated with that. He developed his own kind of way of talking, which I think was his way of trying to minimize just how awkward it sounded. But again, you know, people have rated him perhaps in the top 5 American presidents, and yet he's frail, sickly, can't go to school with other kids as a child. He can't see well. Like, if you looked at him as a young boy, you think this poor child is just going to have a hard time of it. When he was still a boy, one day he came across 2 other boys who were bigger than him and older than him, and they decided to pick on him. And Theodore, one thing that he always did have was courage. And so he tried to stand his ground against 2 boys that had a lot of extra pounds and height on him. It's 2-1. And they basically had their way with him. They humiliated him, even though he's doing the best he can to fight back. He couldn't. He was completely outmatched and outnumbered. But it humiliated him. And so he went to his dad after that and said, basically, Dad, would you enroll me in boxing lessons? And he just determined, as he often did, that this would never happen to him again. He would never again be in a place where people could bully him, push him around. And so even as an adult, I mean, in college, he was on the boxing team, and he went to Harvard ultimately and did overcome his asthma. But even as the American president, he would have people he would have some bouts of boxing with just to stay in shape and exercise. And it seemed as if in some ways he spent his whole life trying to prove that he was a real man, that people couldn't bully him. And so it's just interesting. Here's a frail child that is easily bullied. And so he just determines people aren't going to push me around anymore. And I'm going to be tough, and people are going to respect me. And so, of course, he's the one that comes up with the political motto, walk softly but carry a big stick.
Yeah.
He's the one that, when he is the Undersecretary of the Navy, determines that he's going to build the strongest Navy, at least next to England's, so that the world takes the United States seriously and doesn't try to push them around. And so in much of his political leadership later, it's going to, in many ways, you think it's his own personal story. No one's going to push us around. People are going to respect America, and we're going to be tough, and we're going to have a good army and a good Navy.
So, Richard, you do other things besides this podcast.
When you give me time, when you let me off.
Surprise, surprise. One of those things is a quarterly devotional conference call in partnership with Workforce Ministries. The next one coming up is October 9th, and it's at 7:30 a.m. till 8:15 a.m. Eastern Time. Can you tell us a little bit about what to expect?
Yeah, those are fun. It's a live call that you call in, and people are calling in from all over the country. I'll do a devotional live on the phone with folks on something to do with the marketplace, how to be working with God or seeing God at work in your workplace or something related to that.
Yeah.
And people can also submit questions that I'll address. And then I always take some time. You can also submit prayer requests. And so before, at the close, I'll pray for those requests, and then we'll be on our way to work. But it's at a time where people can call in. I've got people calling in from Phoenix and California and all the way across the East Coast. And it's just kind of a great way to start a day once a quarter, where you just get an extended devotional thought. You maybe have a question answered that you really wanted me to address personally on that setting, and then you get prayed over. And so great way just to join a bunch of other believers across the country to start your day before you go to the workplace. That's
great. And we're going to leave all the information, the call-in number, the access code, all that will be found in the show notes.
The interesting thing with Roosevelt was that he really admired his father, and his father had said to him early on, son, at one point his father had said, son, your mind is good, you want to do the right thing, but you need a body that can enable you to do it, and that really sat with Theodore, and he decided, I've got to train my body, I've got to toughen up my body, because my mind wants to do all these great things, but I can't do it as a weakling. So he loved and admired his father. But his
Sounds like
father
he
died
really-
early. You know,
He really internalized that.
yeah, and
mantra.
then the problem is, and his father would tell him that he was a good boy, and so his Theodore developed a lot of high morals. He was a very moral person, a very religious person, a church-going person. He didn't imbibe in alcohol and certain things like that. He was, as best we can tell, very faithful to his wife and so on. But he because he admired his father, and one of the things that Theodore really tried to do was to live with integrity. And for him, integrity meant living in such a way that you wouldn't mind all your story being made public, and especially your father knowing about it. His integrity basically was, I need to live in such a way that if my dad heard the news of what I'd done, he wouldn't be ashamed of me. He wouldn't be disappointed in me. The sad thing is that Theodore's father dies while he's still quite young. And two things about his father that are kind of interesting. He's very the most influential person in his life, definitely. But two things about it. One is that Theodore's father married a woman from Georgia. And so you've got a guy from New York marrying somebody from the South. Well, then the Civil War broke out. And his wife had all kinds of relatives fighting for the Confederacy. And so she basically pled with her husband and her sons, some of them were fighting age, not to serve in the Northern Army because she just couldn't bear the thought of her sons shooting at their uncles and cousins on the southern side. And so they did what they could to sort of support the war effort, but they didn't sign up themselves. And again, when that was, and part of that was his father was a peaceable man, and he was for the North, but he wanted to respect his wife and keep good relations with the relatives.
Yeah.
But Theodore, who could have joined the army as a young man, always kind of felt the shame of that. Abraham Lincoln was putting out calls for Northern boys to join the army, and he hadn't signed up. And interestingly, Theodore had a couple of uncles who fought in the South, and at one point they actually took a ship and went on a marauding mission trying to sink Northern ships. And they sank and looted about 60 or more until they were finally cornered by a Northern ship in, I think, the English Channel, and were finally sunk. And they escaped, and quite heroic, amazing stories that they would tell later. And so Theodore would hear these stories of these heroic Southern fighters and soldiers that were his relatives, and then he was kind of embarrassed that his father and brothers all just sat on the sidelines. And so Theodore just determined that was one. If he were to critique his father, he would have said one of the critiques was, well, he was sort of a peaceable man that didn't jump into the biggest conflict that the nation had ever experienced. And Theodore just sort of made a resolve that, boy, he wouldn't sit out any more conflicts.
Right.
So when the Cuban War breaks out, and they're putting in a call for volunteers, Roosevelt by this time actually is working in Washington. He's the Undersecretary of the Navy, but he actually quits his job in the Navy and goes and joins the Army because he desperately wants to make sure that for the family honor, he's on the front line. He doesn't want to be in a support role. I mean, here he is basically in the at that time what would have been like the Pentagon in a sense, but he doesn't want to be in an office job when there's bullets flying somewhere else. And so he, of course, joins what became known as the Rough Riders, and he becomes a colonel. And as they're charging up San Juan Hill in Cuba, he is just anxious. I mean, just beside himself to make sure he doesn't miss out on the hottest part of the action. And he's actually riding a horse up the hill, which of course makes you much more exposed, a bit an easier target. And he is at the front. In fact, he charges up so fast. There's times he's coming upon gun emplacements and things without any men with him. They're still lagging behind because they're having to go up by foot. At one point, he came across some of the soldiers who were hiding afraid of the gunfire. And he just shouted at them. He said, "I'm sitting on a horse," he said, "and I'm not afraid. What are you guys doing hiding? Get up and let's charge." And so he was just determined that he would prove himself in battle,
right,
and that he would prove that he was not a coward, even though his relatives had sat out the Civil War. And so you just see this certain drive in Roosevelt where it's like he's got something to prove his whole life.
Right.
And because his dad dies early, he never gets to hear his dad say, "Well, son, you grew up to be quite a man." It's like his dad will never know. And so it's like no matter what I do, I can never prove to the one person that really mattered to me that I wasn't a coward, and I was a brave person. And so his whole life, he's, in one sense, you feel like, well, this guy's kind of flawed in a sense, because he's got this need to prove himself. But the interesting thing is that with a lot of these people who do accomplish a lot, if they can channel that insecurity, those needs, into something positive, then they actually can accomplish a lot. And the other thing with his father at one point was nominated for a political position. He was a respected person. People liked him, but he fell into kind of a political quagmire where there were two camps, and it had really nothing to do with Theodore's father. It just had to do with two sides and who was going to get their way. And so it came to a vote of the Senate, and the Senate did not approve Theodore Roosevelt's father for the job. Well, of course, people were against him, were pointing out things critical and trying to smear him. And for a sensitive man, it was just too much to endure. And Theodore's father took sick, ultimately, just wore him down and demoralized him. And ultimately he died, and died as a young man. And Theodore always felt that politics was an ugly game, and that politics had worn down his father. And if there was a reason for it, it was his father was too genteel, too civilized, and not enough of a fighter. If he were to critique his father, he would have said, well, he just was too nice. And so Theodore decided, if I'm going to be in politics,
not going to be that nice.
I'm going to be tough, and people won't push me around. I'll be as tough as nails if I have to be. And of course, that did him well for the most part. And he helped make America tough in their Navy and their Army. And he gave a lot of pride. He was one of the last, in fact, the subtitle of this biography is The Last Romantic. He romanticized America, much like Ronald Reagan would do in the 80s. He held up America as not just a sort of uncivilized outpost out in the colonies, but as a major power in the world, and something to be proud of. And in fact, at one point, when he builds a big Navy, he actually, in this last year as president, sails the Navy around the entire world, has them 16 battleships, just this massive armada that goes around the world, just letting the whole world know America is now a superpower. And at the time, interestingly, they were already concerned about Japan and the domination they had in Asia. And so the battleships all dock in Japan at one point to let Japan know what the Americans have. Of course, in another generation, the Japanese will come and sink a whole bunch of America's battleships at Pearl Harbor. But or even back in his day, in the 1800s, Roosevelt already can tell that Japan's going to be, they're going to have conflict at some point. And so he's letting them know now, we just want to show you what we've got, and you better be careful about how you push us around. So interestingly, Roosevelt is one of those guys who you don't have to look very far to see real flaws that he has.
Yeah.
And yet he's able to turn a lot of that into positives. And
it sounds like he can really channel that into the right direction.
And he, and we've talked a lot about this, just the power of ambition. He's ambitious. He wants to prove some things.
Yeah.
But ambition can be channeled so that you accomplish great things. And he does accomplish a lot. He also takes on the Panama Canal, and which becomes a huge, lasting part of his legacy. It was an enormous undertaking, which and only someone of his perseverance and tenacity and just stubbornness could probably have ever pulled that one off. And so he tackles several major problems that America faces. He served in the Cuban War with the Rough Riders, not a huge worldwide conflict, but then he doesn't really have to deal with a lot of major conflicts again until really World War I, which by then he's not the president. But he deals with other problems, and that's one thing about Roosevelt, I think, that makes him a great president is he never shies away from tackling problems. And
we've talked about other presidents that preceded great presidents. I think of who was the one that came before Lincoln. So you don't
Buchanan.
even know. Buchanan.
Yeah.
Maybe they presided over a peacetime. And there weren't any really major battles during his presidency. Is that right?
Right. While he was president, there wasn't.
Okay.
There were some financial crises and other crises, that he tackled. But
it's just interesting that he serves in a peacetime, and I feel like a lot of the presidents that serve in peacetime sort of get overlooked because there doesn't seem to ever really be a big crisis that they have to rise to the occasion.
And so he, in some ways, Roosevelt's kind of like a Churchill. Like he's looking for something worthy to tackle, to something big, a problem to undertake. And so, so he does address a number of issues in America at the time. Interestingly, he never quite knew what to do about the race problem. He was not a racist, but he had a lot of the traditional sort of stereotypes, and he didn't. There were some issues he just didn't know how to get his hands around. But when he did see a problem, he kind of jumped on his horse and he charged in, and some of that meant that he could be a little clumsy in what he did, but he didn't sidestep things. And it's kind of interesting because Roosevelt also just, and a lot of great people have some luck, like for instance, I've been to San Juan Hill in Cuba, and if you're sitting on a horse charging up a hill, and you've got people in gun emplacements at the top shooting down at you,
it's pretty hard to miss.
And he was not a small man then. It's like George Washington. He should have been killed a number of times, but it's almost like fate somehow just kept him around. And so there's a certain amount of luck involved in becoming a great, famous person. He could easily have been killed. And then he is actually vice president under McKinley. And even that, he was such a bull in a china shop in some ways that he had some enemies. There were people that thought he was an overachiever. He was at one point he was in charge of like the chief of police in New York, and so he'd actually walk the streets at night in disguise, and he'd find policemen that were on duty that were taking naps, and he'd be checking up on you, and he was cleaning up corruption and a lot of guys just didn't have the courage to do that, but he would tackle the hard problems, and he always took his jobs very seriously, and whatever he led, he turned around and straightened up and made better, or at least he thought he was. And so so interestingly, he's vice president under McKinley, and McKinley's a very different leader than Roosevelt. McKinley's much more sort of diplomatic and genteel and good with people, and Roosevelt, in his own sort of brash way, sort of feels like, well, McKinley's he needs to be more direct and get more things done, and he's not addressing some things that ought to be tackled. And then all of a sudden, McKinley is assassinated, and Roosevelt suddenly becomes the president. There were some people, in fact, even McKinley's chief of his party and his campaigns and his political advisor, at one point, his name was Hanna, he actually said, "Do you realize there's just one life between the presidency and that madman?" And he's talking about Roosevelt because he was just such a overachiever, attention seeker. Roosevelt loved the limelight. But then sure enough, McKinley is assassinated, and all of a sudden Roosevelt is the president, and so there's certain fortune there. You know, you're not sure if he would have won election as president if McKinley had just served out his term, but he kind of gets in the back door and has time to kind of show his stuff and become popular among the people. And so, you know, there's several people that you think, well, if it had not been for an assassination, would he have? And later, I think Roosevelt was never big on self-reflection. He tended to see things in black and white terms, and he was usually the white person, and whoever was opposing him was the evil dark person. But Roosevelt, I think, may have ultimately kind of realized, well, McKinley actually got a lot done. He just didn't act like a bull.
Right, yeah.
You know, he used diplomacy,
different
but
tactics. He
sort of got what he wanted, and he did become president on his own, and maybe there's more than one way to lead, but that was, you know, one of Roosevelt's probably greatest weaknesses was he saw everything in terms of black and white. You're for me, you're against me. There were not a lot of gray areas in his perspective. And so that also meant that, you know, in terms of things that he failed at, he lost some people who would have been his supporters, who should have been his supporters. But he would often castigate people. If they disagreed with him, it was because they just didn't have character, or they had evil motives, or they had problems. And instead of just recognizing, well, maybe there's more than one way to look at this. Maybe they actually want what's best for me, and they're just cautioning me about some things that could lead to disaster. He tended to just assume that if you didn't agree with him, that you must have sinister motives and be a bad person. And he was always the righteous person.
Right.
And maybe there's the last two things just to say about that. He also, of course, he was reelected, so he did win an election to be president the second time. And so he basically had served out 2 terms, most of the first term and then all of the second term. And he had at one point declared that that there was some wisdom in just it's sort of an unwritten rule that you just serve 2 terms as president, then because George Washington had set that precedent. Washington certainly could have run a 3rd time and been elected, but he thought that was enough. And so most people had followed that example. The few people who ever tried to beat it, like General Grant, tried to run for a 3rd term later and lost. And so Roosevelt, he just said it's just better to step aside. And so Taft, his chief lieutenant, is elected in his place. But Roosevelt had grown just to love the limelight. He loved being able to pontificate and have an audience listen to him talk about what mattered. He loved being able to fix things and make them better. And he just was not designed to be on the sidelines. And he tried for a while. He actually went on a long safari in Africa. He went on he did what he could to try to get out of the country and get out of the way, but he just couldn't help it. And people would come to him, and Taft was a much different kind of leader. He was a good man, but he was not the person that just sort of captivated everybody. And so people began to compare, like they often do, and people began to tell Roosevelt, well, we really need a leader like you in such a time. And he enjoyed hearing that.
And it doesn't take much to
ultimately,
stroke
after
the ego.
one term of Taft as president, he came back, Roosevelt did, and decided to run against him for the Republican nomination. And it was deeply, deeply hurtful to Taft. Taft was trying to do the right thing. Taft had tried to reach out to Roosevelt and seek his guidance and support, and was not trying to handle Roosevelt to the best he could, and yet still prove that he was his own man and not just a puppet of Roosevelt's. But Roosevelt runs against him in the primaries and ultimately loses to him, not so much because he wasn't more popular, but because the Republican machinery was set up so that the powers of the Republican Party ultimately would decide, and they finally had Roosevelt out. And as much as he was popular, he was also a loose cannon, and they were ready to stick with the guy who was president. And so Roosevelt should have just let that be enough for him, But then people approached him with the Progressive Party and said, well, why don't you run as an independent then? Run for the Progressive Party. And so he does. And that, of course, was a huge mistake, really, because what happened is he just basically divided the Republican vote now. There were basically all the Republicans had two different candidates. And so he actually ends up getting more votes in the election than Taft does. He garners more votes. But Wilson actually gets more votes than Taft or Roosevelt and becomes the president. And of course, if Roosevelt had not run, if all those Republican votes had just gone to one person, then they would have won. The Republicans had more votes, but they divided theirs in two. And so Wilson ends up becoming the president. And one of the great errors, I think, of Roosevelt was he just didn't know when to stop and when his time was done. And the allure of the limelight and all the prestige and all the reporters wanting to know his opinions were very seductive to him. And although he always spoke in terms of righteousness, and I'm just doing what's best for the country, sometimes it was hard not to think, well, but it also seemed like it's best for you.
Yeah.
And, so the seduction for leaders sometimes of just knowing, you start to identify your success with your organization's success, your company's success,
right?
And you start to justify things. And the hardest thing for people, he's to this day rated perhaps the top 5 presidents, oftentimes rated in number 4, number 5 spot, but perhaps might have had even a greater legacy had he just known when his time was done and a time to be an elder statesman that supported the younger guys instead of the need to still be in charge.
Well, I think that's a great lesson for all of us to learn is know when to step down and just provide support to that next generation coming up. And I know you talk a lot about that, and we've mentioned that on here as well. And Roosevelt's a really interesting guy.
He is.
And I hope we hear from our listeners. Any questions that you have about him later on, we'd love to answer those. And thanks for sharing with us about Roosevelt today.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.